Hi again, Wayne Moore on the study of God's grace and salvation. One of the first questions we need to ask is who needs God's grace? Well, just as a reminder, God's grace is unmerited favor, unearned gifts that He gives. So, who needs these gifts? Who needs God's grace? Because in this age in America, I was raised, you were probably raised, that we should work hard, get a good education, do well at school. You do all those things and you'll get a good job, you'll get a good wage, and if you be good, you'll deserve good things. You'll get good things. Live the American dream. That's how we're raised. It tends to make us think that we are good people with good intentions. But is that really the case? And this is where this video is a little bit hard to make because I'm afraid I have some really bad news for all of us. This bad news comes from the fact that we all have a common end point to our lives, and that is death. Now, is death really the end? That's a whole other video session, and I'd love to get to that sometime. But no, death is not the end. Death is not the stopping of existing. But we all die. Why do we die? I believe that we die because we receive the just wages for what we are doing. Romans 6:23 says that the wages of sin is death. The fact that we all die is evidence that we all sin, and we sin against a holy God. Romans 3:23 says that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. So we all sin. But where did this come from? Well, this goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve were in the garden, and God says, I have these assignments for you. Adam had named the animals. God told them to take care of the earth, and God blessed them, and God blessed all the animals as well. But God had one restrictive requirement on Adam, and that was of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, do not eat. For in the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. Well, of course, we know Satan came along in the form of a serpent, questioned God, and said, why would you trust God? He's withholding good things from you. He knows what will happen if you eat. And they ate. And in so doing, they made a choice to not follow God. They made a choice to not trust God. God had said to them, trust me. They said, we're not going to trust you. We don't want to follow what you say. As a result of that, then, sin entered the world. And we know that from Romans chapter 5. And in Romans chapter 5, it says, therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, thus death spread to all men because all sinned. If you want to know why we all die, it's because death has spread upon us. That was all through one man. Now that's bad news. It's really bad news that we are all going to die. But fortunately, there's the good news of the gospel, which is coming. But first, we've still got to ask the question, why do we need God's grace? Because I understand I sin, but I don't sin all the time. I'm not really that bad of a person, and I can compare myself to somebody else, and I'm not as bad as Hitler. That's kind of a safe analogy, but you get the idea. We immediately can get defensive, rationalistic when we talk about our sin and how bad I am, and well, do I really need God's grace? I mean, I can earn this a little bit. I can do things and earn my salvation. But in reality, man is totally bad. And I want to introduce a word here that is depravity, not deprived. My children sometimes think that I deprive them of certain video games. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about depravity. How depraved is man? And the term that I believe in is total depravity of man. This is defined by the statement, man is essentially and unchangeably bad. Now, that's from our doctrinal statement at Dallas Theological Seminary, but I love that. It crystallizes down what it means to be totally depraved, that man is essentially and unchangeably bad. That means, left to our own devices, we only have badness. Any good that we have is because of grace that God has given. Because while man is unchangeably and essentially bad, God is essentially and unchangeably good. So this good God comes down to the sinful world, and he could have, by all rights, have killed Adam and Eve right on the spot that day. But in his grace, he did not. Some people point to the Bible and say, well, see, God said you'd die in that day, but they didn't physically die. Well, they surely did die. And it was 1,000 years later, and it was because of God's grace that they didn't die, because had that happened, then God's plan would have been thwarted, and Satan would have won. But God mercifully and graciously then provided a sacrifice. He provided skins for them. Adam and Eve knew that they were naked. God clothed them with skins. Where did the skins come from? I don't believe God just poof and made skins. He could have, but the skins came from animals. And when animals give their skins, they die. And so the animals were innocent. They did not deserve death. They did nothing deserving of death. Man did. But all the way back in Genesis, we begin to see a pattern where God says to the guilty, I will give you grace and you can walk free, but the innocent dies. Does that sound familiar? We'll get to more of that in the future. Grace, God's grace, still had innocent animals die, and the guilty walked free. Doesn't seem fair, does it? Well, that's another thing that we'll see about grace. Some of the most unjust things in the world, leading up to the most unjust thing in the world, is God's grace. But we'll cover that in later videos. So back to the question, who needs God's grace? The answer is we all do, because without the grace of God, we are doomed. And we are damned to eternal torment without the grace of God, because we're totally depraved. In and of myself, I can do nothing good. This is an effect of the fall. And I agree with Augustine's position many centuries ago, who said this, that man cannot do anything on his own to please God. We cannot change ourselves into good people. That is the extent of total depravity. Now, I also want to say, total depravity does not mean that every person is as bad as they could be. Rather, what it means is every aspect of man has been touched by the effects of sin. All of us are in Adam. We are born in Adam. We are sons and daughters of Adam. Being in Adam means that we are now enslaved to sin. We really, on our own, do not have the ability to please God. And after all, our eternal destiny depends on our relationship with God. Thank the Lord for His grace, because then we have hope that we can have a good relationship with Him. We can become part of His people, and He can be our God. But it's all based on His grace. It's not based on what I can do. It's not based on what you can do. It's God's grace. And I hope we all will remember that we need God's grace. We need to fall on God's grace. And it's there for us. But the answer to who needs God's grace? It's all peoples, every individual, everywhere, all time, from now until eternity future. And praise God for His wonderful grace, which is part of the next topics we'll be talking about, is how wonderful is His grace.